Before Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles came out, I made a video where I expressed some concerns about how the draft format would play out, based on the fact that it was a small set, with legendary creatures at low rarities, only 5 supported archetypes, and also the fact that to a relatively large degree, it was in the shadow of MTG Spider-Man, which was a small set, also set in New York City, that had come out only a few months before, and was very disappointing, to say the least, for draft players. Today, I'm revisiting that topic, having actually played with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Draft a significant number of times, to provide a more complete perspective that will hopefully help you better understand what the format was actually like if you didn't play it, and to better understand how small sets can play out in the future for future formats of this nature. Before we get to that though, today's video is sponsored by Void Monster, an online shop started by MTG artist Forrest ML that creates unique TCG-inspired game accessories and apparel. Every month, there is a new release of exclusive items available only for a limited time, with custom artwork from real artists and no use of AI. This month's Platinum Star Drop features a playmat, deck box, sleeves, and a hoodie. The pre-order period is open now and ends April 5th at noon Pacific time. So if you want to pick something up, use my link in the description to head to voidmonster.org before the window closes. Thanks Void Monster for sponsoring this video. Now, back to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Draft. I would say that this format was actually pretty solid. It wasn't as good as a lot of bigger sets that we've seen, but it was also not a catastrophically bad set like Spider-Man, and it was nowhere close to that. I had fun playing this set. I drafted it over 20 times so far, and it's the sort of format that ends up playing out a lot differently in many ways from a typical draft set, but not in necessarily ways that make it worse. A lot of the time, the way a draft format plays out is there's an early period where you're exploring the decks, figuring out what's good before the meta settles, and this is a period that's a lot of fun where you can kind of get a sense, oh, I kind of understand that this deck is better than the other players because I've gotten to experiment with it more, or I happen to play it early, and so I can kind of reap the benefits before other players catch up of understanding what's good in a format. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles kind of lacked that kind of period, or that period was a lot smaller because of the small nature of the set, because there were only the 5 archetypes, and because there were just less cards to try out. When you're testing a set that has like 190 cards versus a set that has like 270 cards, just over the course of like 5 drafts, you play against the cards a lot more, you play with the cards a lot more, and you kind of get an understanding of what's good a lot faster. That being said, once the set kind of settled into a relatively stable meta, where you kind of understand these are the decks, these are how they play out, these is how they match up with one another, the format ended up playing out more like a mini constructed format than a lot of draft sets would, because there were, I would say, kind of 3.5 main decks in the format, because the way it ended up playing out was black-white was one of the archetypes. That was maybe the best archetype in the set, especially because it was relatively simple to play. There was a blue-red deck that was also really good for artifacts, and then the green decks kind of all played out as these soupy, splash a lot of things, oftentimes playing 5 colors decks, which kind of put the blue-green deck and green-black deck into the same bucket, and then red-white was a deck that got played a little bit less frequently and was a little bit less powerful than like blue-red or black-white, but was still a deck that you could play and had some solid cards in it. And so that's kind of like why I said 3.5, because you didn't play against red-white quite as frequently in my experience. But it ended up kind of being this relatively stable metagame where you had kind of the aggressive deck of the black-white deck, you had kind of the mid-range deck of the blue-red deck, and then you kind of had the control deck of the multicolored green deck. And in a relatively stable metagame, they could kind of face off against each other, and you kind of had a relatively distinct range of matchups you could play. Playing the decks against each other was kind of interesting and just led to some fun scenarios. I think the cards themselves were pretty well designed. There was a lot of interesting gameplay patterns just built within the like archetypes themselves. You had some mini combos you could try to assemble in any of the individual decks. And overall, I think the format actually played out pretty fun. And I wouldn't draft a set over 20 times if I wasn't having at least a solid time doing it. And I actually did have a good amount of fun playing the set, figuring it out. Because even though the early on-ramp period of the set wasn't necessarily as deep, the figuring out of how the decks were going to match up against each other, which cards you really wanted to prioritize to like give yourself an edge in a particular matchup, how you built your decks to kind of beat other decks that were in the same realm, that part of the format, I think, gave a lot of room for exploration, because even though it was kind of like the way I would view constructed, where like you can kind of like play the games in a certain way based on kind of knowing how the decks are going to play out, because there was less variance in how they look. So in constructed, your opponent has 4 copies of each card in their deck, and in this, and so you kind of know, oh, if they're holding up 2 mana, they probably have this. This is what their curve is going to look like. If they don't play a card on turn 2, what do you think they have? If they're holding up 3 mana on turn 3, 3 and they didn't make a play and they're playing these colors, what do they have? It was a lot easier to figure that out because of the small nature of the set, and that kind of gave a unique angle to this sort of format versus a set that's bigger, has more options, and therefore it's a little bit harder to figure out what your opponent might have, which some might say gives less depth to the gameplay, but it is a different like level of like understanding where you're like, okay, I think this is actually the way to gain an edge in the format versus just building a good deck, because you can gain a lot of value by kind of anticipating what your opponent is up to. To revisit some of the concerns that I had about this set leading into it, first of all, I would say that it is so much better than Spider-Man. Like, it shouldn't even be in the same conversation. The reason that it is because it's also set in New York City and it's followed up shortly thereafter. But I think that comparing this set to Spider-Man is just very unfair, and this set is a lot better. And I think just the cards in general are just much better designed. They work together a lot better, and I wouldn't put those two into the same conversation. I think this set is actually like a set that I would like. I played and had a lot of like good amount of fun with, and Spider-Man is a set that I did not really play a lot, and it just had a much worse overall feel to it as well. And I think that's because, as I said when I talked about the Spider-Man set in the past, they kind of had to rush the design to actually make it as a set, whereas this one, they actually kind of built it as a set from the beginning. I think another thing that was big for this set was the fact that on Arena, you could play like a normal draft with like one pick at a time versus pick two draft. Pick two draft is a format that I think makes a set feel a lot less fun to play and a lot less skill intensive to play, and gives you a lot less decisions, because if you think about it, it gives you like half as many decisions to make during the draft, because instead of going one pick at a time, you get like half as many you get like half as many decision points, because instead of getting like 14 picks time, you get like 42 picks, you only get like 21 picks. And so you get like less time in those situations. And so I think that having normal draft instead of pick two draft only was a really big win for this set as well. I think that I had some concerns about there being particular cards that were really underpowered or really overpowered, and how that could potentially really impact the format. And I will say that Mighty Mutanimals being an uncommon that was better than almost all of the rares in the set was a factor. The fact that it was a smaller set meant you saw Mighty Mutanimals a lot more. You were playing against this crazy, like I would say overpowered uncommon a lot of the time. And when you saw it, it would definitely warp which deck you were trying to draft. But especially because the soupy green decks often weren't dipping into white as much. So it was kind of a payoff for being in black-white specifically, or maybe sometimes even red-white. But the fact that there was one really strong card like Mighty Mutanimals just gave like an extra oomph to those decks, and there were definitely tools to fight it. Even though it was quite strong, it could be really annoying to face. So I will say that was a complaint about the set, is that one really strong card did get seen a lot more frequently because there was just less cards to choose from. So you saw each individual card a little bit more in your pack. So really strong uncommons like that. And the fact that a lot of like Red's commons in particular were really derpy and not very good kind of impacted that color in a negative sense as well. But it did benefit from the fact that Red kind of would often pair well with the blue artifact cards. And so you could get some of the Red artifact good cards a little bit later. So that kind of balanced out a little bit as well. So I was concerned going into the set that individual balance of one card or one color being a little weaker could really drastically impact the set. And it did have an impact, don't get me wrong, but I do think that the format was able to kind of a little bit recover from the fact that Mutanimals was super strong and Red's commons were a little bit weak. I will also say I was concerned going into the set that legendary cards, specifically legendary commons, would be a factor. And I will say that that was a really annoying aspect of the format. I wouldn't say it was a deal breaker, but when it came up, you felt kind of like you were getting robbed almost, because a lot of the legendary cards were pretty good. And so you would play like 2 or 3 copies in your deck sometimes because you just didn't have a lot of good options all the time. It's not like there was like in a typical set where that's got a bigger card file, there might be like 3 common white 2-drops to choose from. And in this set, there was 2 common white 2-drops to choose from, and one of them was legendary. So if you happened from your distribution to see the legendary white 2-drop like more times than the non-legendary one, you could end up in a spot where you had 3 copies of it, and you felt like you kind of had to play the 3 for curve reasons. And then anytime you drew both of them in your opening hand, you felt like kind of quite bad about it. Though I will say that it was the white common and legendary 2-drop was pretty good. So it was a card you were happy to have. It's just the fact that it was legendary meant that you would just get these games where you felt like you were getting kind of cheesed out by your own deck just by the nature of having legendary creatures. And I don't think it was a satisfying gameplay thing. And if there was kind of the option to have these legendary characters without actually having them be legendary, I think that they would kind of have chosen not to have that, because I don't think it was like a design choice, more so as a flavor choice for the universes beyond nature of the set. Speaking of universes beyond nature of the set, I do think that the fact that this set kind of had a lot of silly things going on versus being more of like a realistic New York did kind of make it feel a little bit more at home in Magic the Gathering. I mean, in Spider-Man, we were seeing things like pigeons and taxi drivers and stuff like that are very much real world stuff. And even in this set with like the pizzas, they kind of made all of the pizzas like non-existent weird pizzas. Not to say that that was like, I don't know, aesthetically very pleasing, because the pizzas all kind of looked unpleasant to eat. But a lot of the time the cards kind of had these like, they kind of had like a like weird vibe to them versus just being like more straight up New York City. Like instead of just getting a bagel, you were getting like, I don't know, anchovy and banana pizza, or you were like seeing these Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which are already kind of like very just wacky creatures. Kind of, I feel like that felt a little bit more at home for Magic, at least for me. Though obviously, as I said before, the big repercussions of the flavor impacts of this set are going to be more felt by constructed players who have to see these in standard for the next 3 years, or if they're strong enough for modern or something like that, for much longer going forward until they get like power crept out of the format or whatever, if they are a card that sees play. So I will say that I do think that the concerns about how the flavor impact like looks for Magic the Gathering players is more felt by the constructed players. I still believe that, and I do still have sympathy for the players that just want to play with like the Magic the Gathering kind of worlds. But that's just not something that really impacts draft as much, because I think it just, you go to this world for a month or month and a half, and then you leave that world. And so that's kind of how it feels as a drafter, and that is the perspective that I'm generally trying to express, even though I am sympathetic to the constructed players' plight. So what does this mean for small sets going forward? Well, I think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a step forward for these sets, allowing normal draft, giving an actually pretty satisfying gameplay experience. Even though that on-ramp was smaller and shorter, the fact that the stable gameplay patterns were still fairly interesting did give a decent amount of replayability and some pretty fun experiences playing the cards. That being said, I expect them to be less popular. I don't think there's as much depth to them. So if people are going to have to choose, okay, should I spend a month and a half playing this small format, or should I just save up my gems, save the money from going to my F&M and do other things for a month and a half? I think a lot of people will fall into that later camp. But I think if the sets continue on this trajectory, they can actually be relatively solid going forward. And I think having a bounce back after a set like Spider-Man, I kind of expected there to be a bounce back, because Spider-Man had these unique conditions around it, these constraints around kind of a quick rushed design in many senses. So I thought that a set that was kind of designed from the ground up would be a lot better, because the people who design the game do have a lot of experience. They kind of know what they're doing, which means that a lot of the time they can actually execute when given the proper time and resources. And so I thought the set would be a bit of a bounce back when I was first analyzing the kind of failures of the Spider-Man set. And I will say that it was, but I do think that they kind of have to prove their model now, and they have to kind of execute a few more times before people will kind of have faith in these sets. Because starting off not with a bang is really not where you want to be when releasing a new type of product line. And so hopefully they can kind of solve more of these issues going forward. The legendary creatures is something they've mentioned as being something that kind of like have thought about potentially how they could address that sort of issue with these sort of cards. And I think that if they keep doing these sorts of sets, they can get better and better at doing them. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you made it to the end of the video, leave hashtag complete thoughts, because hopefully giving a impression of the set before actually playing it and then kind of circling back to it was something that you found helpful and interesting, especially because there are going to be more sets like this in the future. And it's better to have these more complete perspectives out in the world, I think, just in general, and just balanced kind of critical analysis. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.